In this video, I'll be explaining how to determine what pattern size to choose when the gauge of your swatch doesn't exactly match the pattern gauge of the sweater that you're planning to make. So I'm going to start in this video with the formula, and then I'll add a few extra thoughts at the end. So imagine you want to make a sweater and the pattern gauge is 20 stitches over 4 inches, but your gauge is 22 stitches over 4 inches, so you don't match gauge. And imagine you wanted to make a garment that had a finished bust circumference of 36 inches. What size in the pattern should you choose to follow? Now imagine in your pattern these are the sizes available, and these sizes refer to the finished bust circumference, and you want your finished bust circumference to be 36 inches. Now if you choose to actually knit the 36 inch size, you're not going to end up with 36 inches if your gauge is 22 stitches. Because this is based on getting a gauge of 20 stitches. So if you get 22 stitches over 4 inches and the pattern gauge is 20 stitches, your stitches are smaller because it takes more of them to make a width of 4 inches. So because your stitches are smaller, if you knit the 36 inch size, you will not get the 36 inch size. Your finished garment will be smaller. So you could just choose to follow a larger size, but which one should you pick? How much bigger do you need? So it's actually a very simple formula to follow. The pattern size that you want to choose to circle and make is your desired finished measurement multiplied by your gauge over the pattern gauge. So for this example, you wanted your sweater to finish at 36 inches. Your gauge is 22, the pattern gauge is 20, and if I work that out on my calculator, 36 times 22 divided by 20 is 39.6. Then you go up and take a look at which size corresponds the closest to 39.6, and that is the 40 inch bust circumference. So if this is your gauge doesn't match, if you follow this formula and choose the size that matches the result in this formula, if you knit the 40 inch size, it will come out very close. That's not exactly 40, but it will come out very close to 36 inches. Close enough that you really could just follow the 40 inch size with all of the instructions, and with a gauge sort of this close, 22-20, that should be enough to get the size that you want. So I just thought I'd add a few extra thoughts at the end. One thing you might need to be careful of is you may need more yardage. So if you have a slightly denser fabric, you may need more yarn than is specified. So you just want to be a little bit careful there. Another thing is that you do have other options. You could change your needle size to try to meet gauge. So if you were getting 22 stitches over 4 inches instead of 20, you might want to go up a needle size and see if you can get closer to 20 stitches. I'm basing this formula on the assumption that you actually really like the fabric that you're getting on 22 stitches. You might have chosen a different yarn than the one that was used in the pattern, and you don't think it would look very nice at a looser gauge. So I'm doing this on the basis that you really want to use, you like that fabric and you want to continue and knit the pattern with a gauge of 22 stitches. Another thought is that your row gauge may be off. I haven't mentioned the row gauge here. Now, your stitch gauge might be a little bit tighter. Your row gauge also might be a little bit smaller. To some extent, if it's not too different, that should be just taken into account by knitting the larger size. With the larger size, you may need to knit a few extra rows. For example, if it was a top-down raglan, you may have an extra raglan increase in there, which would involve a couple of extra rows, and that may compensate for the row gauge difference. Now, if your stitch gauge is on but your row gauge is off, that's a different situation altogether. What I'm addressing here is your stitch gauge is off and you're going to knit a different size. If your stitch gauge is on but your row gauge is off, so you're getting stitch gauge, you should knit the size that you want to end up with, but you may need to adjust. Let's say it's a top-down sweater let's say a top-down raglan, you may need to adjust the rate of increases. So that's a different situation altogether. What I'm addressing in this video is just if your stitch gauge is off. If your row gauge is off by a little bit as well, you're knitting a larger size, that may take into account the row gauge difference. A couple more extra thoughts. How different a gauge is too different. So 22 stitches versus 20 stitches. 22 over 20 is 1.1. I'll confirm it with a calculator, but 22 divided by 20 is 1.1. And if it was in reverse, if your gauge was a little bit looser, 20 divided by 22 is about 0.91, I think. So 20 divided by 22 is about 0.91. So if it was exactly 1, that means you've met gauge. If it's a little bit larger than 1, your stitches are a bit tighter. If it's a little bit less than 1, your stitches are a bit looser. This kind of difference, 0.1 over, that's 0.09, about 0.1 under, is not a great difference. Going up or down a size should be enough to just to end up with a garment the size that you want, but still resembling the sweater that was made and fitting you the way that that sweater was intended. If you start getting very different, like let's say 24 over 20, that's 1.2, you're really starting to get into quite a different sort of garment and a different sort of look. So around the 0.1 size on either side shouldn't be a problem. You should just be able to knit a different size. When you start getting this far off, you're going to actually have some other issues, potentially like sleeve circumference. It may fit you fine in the bust, but it might be too tight in the sleeves, and you might need to modify the sleeve pattern a little bit. So I don't want to say that this formula is a catch-all for any gauge. If this is more like you're close, it's 21 instead of 20 or 22 instead of 20. But if you got 15 instead of 20, that's a very bulky, that's a much bulkier fabric, a very different fit, and going to be a very different look, and you might want to choose a different yarn. So I hope that video has been helpful for you. It won't solve every issue. You may need to pay a little bit more attention to things like sleeve circumference and length, and if possible, try it on as you go, but it's your best starting point. Obviously, we want to sort of know where do we begin in the sweater. This will help you at least choose the size to start with and then follow those directions if you want it to end up with the desired finished size if your gauge doesn't match.